Welcome to Boys in the Hood TV. Today we tapping into the streets of Chicago, and we're gonna be talking about the female teenage shooter, Jacqueline Montanez, aka Loca D, who executed 2 Latin King members in 1992. Now, Chicago in the early 90s was plagued by gang violence, similar to Los Angeles. Now, Loca D was born and raised on the west side of Chicago in Humboldt Park area, home to the gangs like the Latin Kings and the Maniac Latin Disciples. Loca D had a very rough upbringing. Stepfather who was known to abuse her, and he was also a member of the Latin Kings. By the age of 13, Loca D would join the Maniac Latin Disciples. She would go through the 1-minute initiation stage where she was beaten by 3 gang members. Now, the Latin Disciples are one of the most ruthless gangs in Chicago, and at the time, they were at war with its main rivals, the almighty Latin Kings. Now, by the 8th grade, Loca D would drop out and would hang on the block all day long. Her mother, Sandra Lorenzi, would eventually hand her over to child services. But this would not be enough to stop Loca D, because even while in child services, she would run away constantly and link back up with the gang members. At some point in time, she began selling drugs to make money. And hanging out on that block, she would survive a shooting, which would leave her with a graze mark on her shoulder. She would get into multiple fights, living a typical gang life. But everything would take a turn for the worse. On May 10th, 1992, Loca D's friend by the name of Ishmael Torres would lose his life. At around 1 a.m., Torres sat in Loca D's car on the block as Loca D was nearby having a conversation with another person, when suddenly, Latin Kings drove by and opened fire on the car. Torres was struck in his temple, instantly killing him. By the time police arrived on the scene, Torres was found deceased behind the wheel of the car. Now, it's well known that Torres was not a gang member, but was known as the deaf kid on the block that the Latin Disciples would look out for. Torres' death would enrage Loca D and many other gang members, but Loca D would be out looking for revenge immediately. Word would start going around that police officers had arrested a man by the name of Hector Reyes of the Latin Kings, and he was currently in custody as a suspect. They would also tell her that Reyes was about to be bonded out that same day. So Loca D decided that she would show up to Reyes' bond hearing just so she can get a good look at the man who shot and killed her friend. Just 2 days later, on May 12th, Loca D will be ready for war. Her and 2 other girls, 16-year-old Madeline Mendoza, aka Tootie, and 22-year-old Marilyn Malero, aka Moneca, will go out to look for Latin King members to seek revenge for Torres' death. The 3 would drive around Latin King hood, look for someone to shoot. But as time would go by, they realized they didn't see anybody on the block. But then out of nowhere, a car with 2 men pulled up next to him, and inside that car was Latin King member Jimmy Cruz and Hector Reyes. Now, immediately, Loca D recognized Jimmy Cruz because her father, who was also a Latin King, and she knew a lot of Latin Kings from that area. But in that instant, she will also spot Hector Reyes, the man who killed her friend just a few days ago. Now, initially, Jimmy Cruz would get hostile and ask Loca what she was doing in his hood. She'll simply reply, "I'm just riding around." But Cruz would spot Tootie in the back seat and start flirting with her. And he immediately asked the girls to follow him to the park. So Loca D and the 2 other females followed Jimmy Cruz and Hector Reyes to the park. Now, while at the park, they would be outside talking when Hector Reyes would ask Loca D to come into the bathroom with him. Jimmy Cruz and Mendoza and Marilyn will both wait outside. Once they got inside the bathroom, Hector Reyes attempted to have sex with Loca D, but she refused immediately. And when Reyes asked what the problem was, he brought up Loca D's friend Torres, who had just been killed. And this would piss Loca D off. And as soon as Reyes turned his back, Loca D put out the gun and shot him right in the back of the head. Hector Reyes would die right there. Jimmy Cruz and the girls outside would hear the gunshot, and Loca D would come out. And as soon as Jimmy Cruz saw Loca D, he began reaching for his gun, and that's when Loca D walked him down and opened fire on him, shooting him in the head as he dropped to the ground. As Loca D stood over his body, a car would go by with Latin Kings in it. So immediately the 3 girls ran back to the car and headed back to the Latin Disciples' hood. Once the girls arrived back to the hood, they would start bragging about the shooting that happened. And one of the women by the name of Yvette Rodriguez, who they told about the shooting, would later be arrested that same night on drug charges. And while she was in custody, Rodriguez would tell officers about the murder that she had just heard about. So that following day, on May 13th, Ishmael Torres' family was having a wake for him. And in attendance was Loca D and Marilyn. Rodriguez would show up later wearing their police wire and would meet and greet everybody in the inside. The moment that Rodriguez identified Marilyn and Loca D, Chicago PD would begin making their move. The moment that both girls left the funeral home and headed back to the hood, that's when Chicago PD would pull them over and arrest both of them.
Maniac.
Now, with Loca D and Maryland in custody, Mendoza will be taken into custody just 2 days later on May 15th. While in custody, all three girls will be interviewed by veteran detectives Ernest Halverson and Reynaldo Govera. Now, during questioning, detectives failed to notify Maryland of a right to an attorney, and they used multiple dirty tactics, which led her to giving a false confession and admitting to being one of the shooters who actually gunned down Cruz. Detectives will also use a similar tactic on Loca D and Mendoza, who were both minors. Neither Loca D or Mendoza had any adult present during the time of questioning, which was illegal. Now, detectives would reach out to both girls' parents, but they would lie to Loca D's mother, telling her that there was no need for them to come in because the girls were currently under witness protection after being a witness to a murder. And each time the mother asked about seeing Loca D, police officers will refuse. The moment that the police officers got the confessions in writing, they would then allow Loca D's mother to see her. But by this time, they were now being charged with the murder of Hector Reyes and Jimmy Cruz. About a year later, 16-year-old Loca D will be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The oldest, Marilyn Malero, who is 22 years old, will get the death penalty. And Mendoza, who was also a teenager at the time, will be sentenced to 35 years in prison. Now, as the years went on and the girls spent decades in prison fighting for their freedom after making a plea of being coerced by officers, an investigation will be looked into for police corruption. Detective Reynaldo and Halverson, both who questioned the three girls, were under scrutiny. They were accused of fabricating evidence, falsifying documents, and coercing witnesses in multiple cases. And this would lead to multiple cases that both detectives worked on being under investigation, including Mendoza, Malero, and Loca D's case. And by 2009, Madeline Mendoza, aka Tootie, will be released from prison. And she will be the first to speak out about the police corruption and suing the city of Chicago. Years later, on October 2016, Loca D will have her first resentencing hearing after the U.S. Supreme Court in 2012 found mandatory life sentences given to juveniles violated the 8th Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishments. Now, during this hearing, family members of both Reyes and Cruz would testify that they felt that Loca D should be given life in prison. But Loca D will be only sentenced to 63 years in prison, and with time served, she had an expected release date of 2023. Now, about a year after this resentencing, Loca D would admit to the public that she and she alone was responsible for shooting both Reyes and Cruz, and neither Mendoza or Malero were the shooters in the case. And because of this confession, 3 years later, on April 8, 2020, after spending 29 years in prison, Marilyn Malero, aka Moneca, will be set free. Now, 3 years after this, a federal lawsuit will be filed against the corrupt detectives in the city of Chicago. But also that same year, Jacqueline Montanez, aka Loca D, would also be released from prison. I want to thank everybody for tapping in, and I'll see y'all next time.